I would like to propose one simple and controversial idea. So I'm going to present one idea about higher education, which is purposely simplified, because in this audience, having a very complex discussion is tough. And it's also going to be presented in a slightly controversial way. But I'm going to present a lot of data. And one other angle, which is many of you are here because you are private investors in education, you want to make money. I'm also going to make the case that the ability to make money in education is unparalleled in higher ed versus other sectors, and I will present the data to substantiate this claim. So just a little bit on Parthenon. Many of you will be wondering, who are we? We are the largest advisors to the not-for-profit and for-profit education sector globally. All the countries in dark blue on the screen are ones where we have done on-the-ground education sector projects in the last 12 months. And we pretty much advise all the largest governments and private sector participants in the world of education. So the largest higher education company, Laureate, the largest school company, Cognita, the American government, the Malaysian government, a number of other governments. So I only mention that in that what is the context by which we're going to speak, and it's not just an Indian context, it is an international context. And so the first thing, let's just start with commercial and private education. So what you have on screen are the list of all the billion-dollar-plus education companies in the world. Right? This is the whole thing. There are 15 of them. Now here's how the list works. 6 of the 15 are textbook publishers, all of which make about 90% of their money selling into the United States or Western Europe, markets where a textbook can cost $50 to $100 a go, largely because the buyer is often not the chooser of the textbook. In other words, the government selects the textbook and the student has to buy it, or the state in the United States will select the textbook and then buy it. So that model is not very applicable in the East. In fact, the largest textbook publishers in emerging markets, so we need to exclude Korea and Japan, are relatively small, including the large public ones in China. We then should take out Disney, which we know has a unique brand in the world of edutainment. I think few would claim to have a brand like Mickey Mouse to sell to kids around the world. But even then, they only crossed $1 billion because of what they sell in Western markets, not what they sell in emerging markets. So what are you left with? You're left with higher ed. Of the higher education companies on this screen, only 2 focus on emerging markets. One is Anhanguera, a publicly listed company in Brazil. It's a private company listed on the Brazilian Stock Exchange. And the other one is Laureate, which again makes most of its money in Latin America. In other words, there are no billion-dollar education companies in all of Asia, including developed Asia, by the way. This is interesting because we heard earlier that apparently the Indian education market has $80 billion of turnover. Isn't it strange then that there isn't even one company with 0.5% of that as market share, despite education being fragmented? Interestingly, if we look at the largest vocational training company outside of IT training in any emerging market, so this includes Brazil, Russia, China, India, you can go beyond the BRICS if you want to, you will not find a single $100 million company that focuses on tertiary vocational training. In other words, scale, private education in emerging markets is demonstrated only in higher education. The largest school company in turnover in emerging markets would have about $200 million of turnover, and even then, by focusing on very premium schools that focus on Western expatriates. So that model, again, would not really apply to a country like India. So as you look at it from a commercial perspective, higher ed is the answer to building 150, 200, 250, $500 million business. There is no other demonstrated pathway, and there are economies that are at least 5 and 10 years ahead of us down the road. Remember, all this data includes dear old China next door. Now, let's think about higher education for a moment from a social perspective. So switching, sorry, where does the clicker go? There you go. So what we're looking at is the tertiary enrollment ratio. Now, we've heard by many of the distinguished panelists that maybe the tertiary enrollment ratio is not the be-all and end-all in terms of economic development. Well, yes and no. So this is all self-reported data on the screen. On the y-axis is the tertiary enrollment ratio. On the x-axis is your PPP-adjusted gross national income per capita. what you will see is that even including OPEC countries, which have natural resources far ahead of their populations, this one self-reported piece of data, which is measured differently by each country, in other words, there's noise in the data, this one variable explains 70% of the discrepancy between the wealth in nations. In other words, if you took total foreign direct investment, if you took total investment in an economy, it would not so cleanly explain why some countries are wealthier than others, why some countries are able to have their people live with dignity, and why some countries are poor and starving. And yes, vocational education, other parts of education are required, but could I suggest that if it works for the entire planet, that perhaps it needs to work for India as well? That if we try going down this path of educating our people without pushing up the tertiary enrollment ratio in a very predictable fashion, that we are in fact trying to do something that hasn't worked anywhere in the world. Could I suggest that if it isn't broke, if it ain't broke, you should say in Americanism, don't fix it. And where we are, even if you measure India at 20%, where Parthenon had us at about 20%, we're below countries like Algeria and Tunisia. There's no point talking about, are we too high already? Surely we would imagine that with our knowledge economy, so to speak, we should be a little bit ahead of Algeria. We're not. We're actually around the same spot as Nigeria. And so I'd like to draw a comparison with China, our next door neighbor. And I realize that Mr. Agarwal has brought up some very salient points about China, and he's absolutely right about them. That said, we can learn from their mistakes while benefiting from what they have done right. So here are the numbers. What you're looking at is India is the blue line, China is the green line. And as Mr. Agarwal pointed out earlier, India has historically been ahead of China in terms of total tertiary enrollment. We've usually had more kids in college than them. But look at what happens. China allows for-profit investment in education in 2000. And look at that. The green line, China, zips ahead to become twice the size of the blue line, India. Now, there are some issues around quality in education in China. That's right. But let's face it, there are some issues around quality in education in India as well. We're very proud of our IITs and IIMs, but we have 16 million kids in higher education. And the IITs, the IIMs, the central universities are a rounding error in that system. Most of our system is largely defunct anyway today. I don't think people would argue that China's is any worse. In fact, let's think about it the other way. Nobody in China is forcing kids to go to college. So if the system there is broken, why are they enrolling? Let's look at it another way. Let's look at who's buying. The total number of international students in India is below 50,000. In China, it's above 290,000, growing at 25% a year, of which over 200,000 come from developed countries. If their system is broken, then why are they ahead? Why are they able to grow their system when nobody's forced to buy it? Certainly not people from abroad, but even from within their own country. And so I would suggest that in the coming knowledge economy, in the third industrial revolution, fine, maybe the blue doesn't need to go all the way up to the green, even though we have more kids than China, but surely the blue doesn't have to be half of the green, and the green is still growing faster. So I would strongly suggest that there's a bit of a warning sign here that I hope our government takes into account. And however it is that the system is addressed, it needs to be addressed at a significant scale. So the question then becomes, okay, fine, but maybe we don't need so much private capital in education. Maybe that's a bad thing, despite the fact that China, Singapore, Turkey, the United States, everybody else allows it. For some reason, it's bad for us. No problem. So let's just look at the numbers, right? Facts are friendly. If we assume that a higher education seat costs between 80,000 rupees to 1 lakh a seat to build, excluding land, right? Excluding land. And if we grow at our historic rate of seats, what will happen is we will add about 900,000 seats a year, which will require $1.8 billion of capex, excluding land, per year. But what will happen if we do this is we actually end up with more college uneducated adults in 2020 than we have today. In other words, we take our demographic dividend and we turn it into a demographic deficit by growing at our historic rate.